Hello, everyone. I'm Ben Laurence. I would like to welcome you to Democracy and AI, Rethinking Rights for Digital Challenges on behalf of the Pozen Family Center for Human Rights, which is celebrating its 25th anniversary at the University of Chicago this year. It's also celebrating the launch of a new human rights major that brings the work of the Pozen Center and human rights into the heart of the intellectual life of the college. So in this context, we are delighted to be hosting this timely and important event with our co-sponsors, including the University of Chicago Law School and the University of Chicago Library. This event could not have happened without your support. I would also like to thank Austin Clyde. During the time we've been lucky enough to have him at the University of Chicago, he has been a dynamic presence, including at the Pozen Center, reaching across disciplinary boundaries with enthusiasm. He taught an important course for us on artificial intelligence, algorithms, and human rights, and it was his vision to connect this curricular event with the idea of this conference that would bring together luminary scholars with students, faculty discussants, and the public in order to focus on pressing issues at the forefront of technology and rights. I would also like to thank the organizers of this event, especially Cliff Chan, the Director of Programming and Events for the Pozen Center, who's worked hard and is even working now to make this a reality and a success. Unless you've been living under a rock, our topic needs no introduction, and yet I will try. The unveiling of ChatGPT-3 and now 4 has captivated the popular imagination and dominated the headlines. This strange disembodied oracle has produced thrill, wonder, curiosity, and delight in users. It was even suggested to me that I might use it to write these very remarks, although in the end I declined that suggestion. But ChatGPT has also been a source of political fear and even existential dread. I think you would have to say that the reactions have been visceral. It's perhaps not so easy to sort through what fears about the future of artificial intelligence are real and what imaginary. But what we know are real are the threats posed by artificial intelligence and machine learning that have already come into the world. For example, in yesterday's New York Times, we were able to read about a police conference in Dubai, where the latest use of these new technologies in state surveillance were gleefully displayed, from facial recognition software to predictive policing tools, and even more dystopian applications that sounded like they had just jumped off the pages of the cyberpunk novels of my youth. We were told in the article that China is not the only state to already be developing and deploying formidable surveillance capacities using this new suite of technologies. They were being pioneered as well in the Middle East and developed by intelligence agencies across the world, including in the United States. If we turn from state power to the digital public square, the threats and challenges loom large there as well. The social media platforms we all communicate with and share ideas with one another, through which we share ideas with one another, shape our experience through their algorithms, determining what content we see and, importantly, don't see, as well as the tailored ads that come to us on the basis of our specific profile and personal data. It's even become a regular feature of our lived experience that we question whether certain apparent people are not, in fact, simulated human beings, in some cases for reasons benign, in other cases built to advance disturbing agendas of disinformation. In this atmosphere of rapidly changing social and political relations, and I should add also with the coming automation of white-collar jobs, which may produce deep and traumatic crises for our body politic, the questions for human rights are pressing. How are we to think of human rights in the dawning age of AI? I'm delighted to hear what our speakers and you have to say about this timely question today. So now I'm going to turn things over to Torsten Reimer, who will introduce our keynote speaker. Torsten Reimer is University Librarian and Dean of the University Library at the University of Chicago. With a background in digital scholarship and research infrastructures, Torsten's career has been focused on making the global knowledge environment more open. Before joining the University of Chicago, he served on the British Library's strategic leadership team as the lead for collection development, digital preservation, research services, and scholarly communication. In previous roles, he developed open access and research data services at Imperial College London and a national program for research infrastructure and tools in the United Kingdom. I will now turn it over to you, Torsten.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks all of you in the room and those of you who are online for joining us today. I'm really pleased that we can host this event today, and I'd like to say just very briefly a few words from my and the library perspective before I introduce our keynote speaker. So I'm a historian by training, and I wrote my PhD on, in fact, early modern history, and specifically on early modern public discourse and the question of how national identity and nationalism came into that. And I feel in many ways this should have been a lesson for me, that progress isn't always as linear as we sometimes believe it is. When I submitted my PhD thesis, I was of the view that there were many challenges in this world, but that we had lots of tools at our disposal to tackle them. And I was very excited about the opportunities in the digital realm. I was really excited, I submitted my PhD in 2006, about using the internet for more participation and public debate and for more access to information. I sort of somewhat naively assumed more access to information and better ways of communicating would be something that increased participation, and then we might all have our different views on how well that works in democracy overall, but I always felt more participation, more access to information enhances debate and gives people more control and say of their life, and ultimately is about building a better life. So that was how I moved on from a PhD into the next stage of my life. And a few years later, I learned that we now had lots of tools to communicate, but it seems that some of the hopes that we had on social media, allowing participation, people to talk from different backgrounds and sort of come together, have not always fully been true. And as I said, I should have really realized this because I sort of tracked the evolvement of media and over 260 years in early modern England. And while the technology has evolved and more people participated, I'm not necessarily sure the discourse on nation has become one that was more open. And in fact, it's become one in the time that I tracked that was more aggressive. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is that I think it's really important to remember a few basic things, which is progress isn't always linear. We can't just assume because a good idea is out there, it will be successful. But also that media isn't something that's neutral, that different media that come up shape a discourse in a certain way. And that can be good or bad, depending on where we stand and where we use it. And ultimately, the same also applies to technology. Technology can be terrifically positive or disastrously bad. And it's really important that at every stage of the process, we critically reflect on what that does. I think this is, as it comes to information, really important for us as libraries because we want everyone to have access to the best information. Increasingly, that access is mitigated through AI. So just from a purely professional perspective, we need to understand how it works. But there are so many other factors to this. Before I came to the United States, I read with some shock that there are some courts that are now using AI technology to help with sentencing. And that when you look at the sentencing that's been passed, you find that some bias that was hard-coded or soft-coded, if you will, into the AI technology based on the data they've been trained with, actually means that we now have racist AI that's advising judges on how to judge people. So there are whole sorts of ways in which artificial intelligence already affects us. And there's increasingly going to be more as we happen to see more automation and more things are driven through technology. So I think on all levels, it's really important that we don't fall for the hype, not the good one and the bad one, but that we critically examine the technology, how we're going to use it and what the implications are. And I think that's something that I think has been a bit of a threat in the professional life of our keynote speaker. And I'll have to resort to a piece of paper because there's too much to say about Sheila Jasanoff that I could remember all of it, because she has had a very varied and distinguished career, and we're really pleased to have you here today. So Sheila is the Porzheimer Professor of Science and Technology Studies at the Harvard Kennedy School. She is a pioneer in her field, and she's authored more than 130 articles and chapters, and is also the author of more than 15 books, including titles such as The Fifth Branch, Science at the Bar, Designs on Nature, Ethics of Invention, and Can Science Make Sense of Life? Her work explores the role of science and technology in law, politics, and policy of modern democracies. She founded and directs the Science and Technology Studies program at Harvard, and previously she was founding chair of the SDS department at Cornell. And she has also held distinguished visiting appointments at leading universities in Europe, Asia, Australia, and the United States. Sheila served on the American Association of the Advancement of Science Board of Directors, and also as president of the Society for Societal Studies of Science. She is a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. And her honors include, most recently, the 2020 Holberg Prize, which has been sort of dubbed the Nobel Prize for Social Science and Humanities. And that was for her prolific academic efforts in the field of science and technology studies. She is also the recipient of the Social Science Research Council's Hirschman Prize, the Humboldt Foundation's Reimer List Award, a Guggenheim Fellowship, an Ehrenkreuz from the Government of Austria, and foreign memberships in the British Academy and the Royal Danish Academy. And then finally, I should say, she holds AB, GD, and PhD from Harvard, and also honorary doctorates from the universities of Twente and Liège. So with that introduction, Sheila, I would like to welcome you on the podium, and thank you very much for being here today.
So thank you, Torsten, for that warm introduction, and Ben, and thanks to the Pozen Family Center, the University of Chicago Library for hosting this event, and of course to my friend and colleague Austin Clyde for having the imagination to bring together the people who are sitting in the room and listening from elsewhere and who'll be joining the discussion today. Ben, you already said in your introduction that hardly a moment goes by without references to the subject matter, and in my email from the last hour, I have a message from Ross Douthat of the New York Times. He's written a piece called Fear of an AI Pundit. So apparently pundits are among the people who think that they might be thrown out of work by the development of AI. But in a sense, the bracketing piece is a message from the US National Science Foundation saying US and the UK announced winners of challenge to drive innovation in privacy-enhancing technologies that reinforce democratic values. That's quite a mouthful. But when you parse it, it is that they're rewarding technological developments that will enhance privacy for the purpose of enhancing democratic values. So that's a double or triple somersault, if you will, at the start of which is that technology does the work and the rest of it is, somehow there to be molded. So in a sense, the sort of arc of what I want to say is that if we really want to think about AI in a way that involves us all and restores some sort of agency to the picture, not only in the hands of computer scientists, then maybe we need to begin somewhere else. And that somewhere else, I would suggest, is more with the human in human rights than with the rights of human rights. That to some extent, what we're talking about is the question of what is at stake when mechanization is again the order of the day. So, one can always do this sort of party trick of the things going on, and I left as the last headline the weird idea that Elon Musk is calling for a pause on AI, citing profound risks to society. How many of you know how long a pause he's asking for? Yeah. 6 months, right? So, of course, 6 months will solve all our problems, but I suppose if we're all rapid thinkers, in the Muskian tradition, then we can all accomplish a lot in 6 months. Democracy itself has been with us for something more on the order of, 2,500 years plus under that kind of name. So, we can obviously get to the solution to AI and democracy a whole lot quicker, probably because we now have AI to harness into the debate, which the Greeks did not have. In any event, another thing that's going on, of course, is generational changes, and the generations come awfully thick and fast. So, no sooner do you unveil ChatGPT than OpenAI plans to up the ante and have yet another descendant of ChatGPT. And so it makes sense to think that John Perry Barlow had it right, that in fact it's the people of the cyber world who are out there sort of to govern us and our productions, and this idea of weary giants of flesh and steel. This is a city that had a good deal of steel in it, so it perhaps has even more resonances in Chicago than elsewhere. So this domain of cyberspace is all novel, it puts things behind us. This morning I had the pleasure of visiting the Roby House across the street before coming to the library, and we were told about how its structural foundation is these steel beams, and it was very much steel and brick. It was very much a different idea from this digital world that we're now in. But is that right? I mean, is it right that we've moved into an era when nothing of the past carries weight any longer, and it is a whole set of new kinds of tools to think with and to think about that will chart the courses of democracy and of rights for us? So what should we be worrying about? I mean, Ross Douthat can worry about whether he will be out of a job in 5 years, 10 years, but that's not surely what all of us collectively are worrying about. And I want to argue that it's not worries about rights as we have conceived of them. So not what are the threats to privacy rights such that the US and UK can go about and get the next best technological system to protect us against erosions of privacy that are also taken as democracy enhancing. I mean, I leave it to your imagination to wonder exactly what kinds of things they have in mind. So privacy, autonomy, liberty, even workers' rights, I mean, these are obviously very important things, but is that the right place to start? Or is it more along the lines of what is it about the human that we consider worth protecting and worth defending? And in order to get at that, I want to suggest that there are some traps that AI leads us into. One of them actually has already been alluded to, Torsten, through no joint planning of our own. But these are the traps that I will suggest of inevitability, singularity, speed, and dispersal. So let me walk you through these. These are not new concerns. So the first thing that any decent historian does, of course, is tell you there's nothing new about the present, and then they'll tell you all the ways in which the present is, after all, distinctive. But in this case, some of the kinds of concerns that we see around AI, whether it's about playing God, whether it is about the surveillance state, I mean, remember 1984, predating AI, questions of loss of control, giving up our power to machines. These are debates that have been with us certainly for the entire length of the 20th century, if not from yet earlier on. And in fiction and in works of art, we have seen these things take particular shape. I think it's actually, in a way, fitting that the world of movies, which is another sort of world of irreality, has been one of the places in which forecasting has preceded, in some sense, the forecasting that technologists do today. So one of my favorite starting places is this film, Forbidden Planet, based on a 1956 screenplay by Alan Adler and Irving Bloch, in which a planet that had been inhabited, settled, civilized by a superhuman race called the Krell had suddenly lost all of its built environment, and people from the Earth went out there to find out exactly what had happened. And there is a theory that emerges, which centers on Freudian psychology in a sense. I mean, at a key moment in the script, somebody says that it was the id that had taken control. So what is the id? Id. It's an obsolete term, I'm afraid, once used to describe the elementary basis of the subconscious mind, monsters from the id. Like you, the Krell forgot one deadly danger, their own subconscious hate and lust for destruction, the beast, the mindless primitive. Even the Krell must have evolved from that beginning, and so those mindless beasts of the subconscious had access to a machine that could never be shut down, the secret devil of every soul on the planet, all set free at once to loot and maim and take revenge and kill. So, a precursor of social media. I mean, did people who designed social media really forget that haters could get together as much as lovers? I mean, this was really such a difficult thing for us to imagine, especially, you know, if you had seen or read Forbidden Planet. I mean, you know, it was already there. It was something that people could have been foreseeing, that we do not unite as human beings only because we have the most lovable ideas in mind for each other. We wish to encourage that, but not necessarily does it happen that these are the only reasons that we get together. And then, of course, Forbidden Planet may be kind of lost to memory, except people who are looking for arcana or who happen to be of a certain age. But much more recently, of course, we have this other vision.
To allow you to jeopardize it.
I don't know what you're talking about, Hal.
I know that you and Frank were planning to disconnect me, and I'm afraid that's something I cannot allow to happen.
Where the hell did you get that idea, Hal?
Although you took very thorough precautions in the pod against my hearing you, I could see your lips move.
All right, Hal. I'll go in through the emergency airlock.
Without your space helmet, Dave, we're going to find that rather difficult. To allow you to...
Oops. So this is a while ago already, and back in 1992, the New York Times had in its Ideas and Trends section a little article wishing happy birthday to Hal and wondering what went wrong. And in that article, they interviewed Arthur C. Clarke, the creator of 2001, and he said, from his home in Sri Lanka, that nothing had happened since the making of 2001 to persuade him that his vision was fundamentally wrong. In a telephone interview, he said that every capability attributed to Hal, a system that can speak, listen, reason, criticize human art, and at one point even read lips, has been shown to be at least theoretically possible. So this is a generation ago, right? I mean, so why the moral panic now, and what are we exactly worried about if people not only foresaw it, but also said it was already possible, it was round the corner? Is it just that we need the train wreck to remember that toxic chemicals get carried in trains? I mean, you know, is it that sort of thing? Is it forgetfulness about the immediate past? Because we in America tend to be a rather ahistorical world, or is it some other things, some other powerful myth-making tendencies inside our culture that lead us in certain directions? And these are my traps, because I do think that there's that kind of myth-making that is abroad in the world. So the first one is this idea of the inevitability trap. It's sometimes called technological determinism. You're on this train, it's going to happen. A lot of my work is in the area of genetics and biotechnology, and to some degree, of course, now also in information technologies. And you know, people have sort of given up on the idea of controlling progress to some degree because they're already persuaded that this is going to happen. So you may as well not stand against it. And if you stand against it because it's already going to happen, then you're a Luddite. I mean, so people have in their minds this definition of a Luddite as somebody who stands against the inevitability of progress. But it is, in a sense, a trap of our own making, right? So we can tell evolution in this way. I think it's a beautiful image of where we might be going if we let the encroaching machine, in a sense, take over the humanness of humanity. And to some degree, of course, the historians of these gadgets that we have, which we kind of could not live without these days, tell the story in this way. I think the first job I held was for teleprompter company, between first and second year of college. And I used to ride into Manhattan, and I used to deal with the punch cards that got fed into those machines. And there was a machine, about as big as that room. And it was considered, really a huge innovation. I think my salary got raised from something like $2 or $3 an hour to $5 an hour during the summer that I worked there, which I suppose was already a precursor of where the technology was going to go. Doubling your salary over the course of a summer, not bad. So it's easy to tell that story of progress. Moore just died recently, as some of you in the audience must know, and Moore's law predicted that we were going to advance, by leaps and bounds in our capacity for storage and processing of information. But what's wrong with that kind of picture of progress? I mean, first of all, of course, it says human progress is the same as technological progress or is bound up with it. It's always linear. I mean, this is the point that Torsten Reimer made in his introduction, that even assuming that progress is a linear thing and it can be mapped in one set of indicators is already profoundly problematic for philosophical and spiritual thinking and also political thinking. It's also universalizing and standardizing in an important way. It assumes that all AI advances are progress, and it forgets the story of the monsters of the id that, are now 50 years old. And why should we be forgetting that? And that all of humanity wants AI. Well, this conference or, show and tell industry show that Ben Laurence described happening in Dubai is a demonstration that some of humanity wants AI more than others of humanity, and they have purposes. It's not that they just want it because it's a cool toy. It is that they want it for some purposes. And, recently there's been a lot of talk about the AR-15 in America and why it is such a desirable commodity. And maybe not everybody who has it, and there may be some people in this audience who have them, maybe they don't think that the purpose is to go and shoot up 9-year-olds. But nevertheless, the question of why people want a technology is somehow subsumed in this idea of progress that, of course, everybody should want this technology because it's there and because we have to evolve with it. And then the notion that all of intelligence can be enhanced by AI. I mean, how many essays are there saying, let us stop and query the I of AI? People are really very busy thinking about how cool the A part is, how speedy, how rapid, how comprehensive. But what is the I of AI? And in what kind of culture and context is the technology put to use? Is it individualist or communitarian? Is it traditional or modern? Is it hierarchical or egalitarian? Is it secular or is it spiritual? These things surely matter to the existence of the technology, because the most basic definition of technology is something that enhances humans' capability of accomplishing something useful, something utilitarian. And if you want to think about where the notion of use comes from, you have to go back to questions about the cultural context in which people think about and define the notion of use. The second thing I want to talk about is the singularity trap. And of course, there's something wildly exciting about the idea that, just think if all the minds in this room could be really hooked up together. I mean, first of all, we would know an awful lot. We would win lots more quiz shows than we might otherwise one-on-one. And there are other things as well. I mean, supposing people's memories could be joined together so that every movie that everybody in this room has seen, or every concert piece that people have played, or every jazz band they have listened to, we could each share each other's memories. Maybe there could even be a little bank of switches in your head. The Ruby House had one panel where there were 12 different switches controlling sconces in the room. But supposing our memories were equipped with those switches, I could say to you, look, I'm going to listen to your music video right now. And maybe that would be great. But what would we be doing? So it's interesting sometimes to look at other fields, neighboring fields. And cheek by jowl with the Kennedy School, we have the Graduate School of Education at Harvard. And one of the major figures in that school is a man named Howard Gardner, whose work is all about multiple intelligences. And you could take this and you could parse it out and say, there are others, and you could add boxes. But I'm sure that we all know people who say things like, I have no memory for faces, or I can't do foreign languages, or I just cannot remember directions. But it turns out that they can do other things. They can remember stories that people told them since they were 2 years old. I mean, they have narrative intelligence. I mean, so our intelligences are not evolved and developed in the same sorts of ways. So what is AI doing, and what is it exactly enhancing? And there we have to turn to the fact that the kinds of intelligences we choose to develop, we don't do that in a vacuum. There's money attached. So there are what you might call political economies of intelligence. And, not everybody in this room probably could create a neft and sell it for a huge amount of money, and who can? And, one might begin to wonder about exactly how that kind of embeddedness produces a particular set of AIs that are already marked as developing some capabilities at the expense of others. And one might then argue that the intelligences that we develop already have normative directions and standards built into them. So it's not that we're enhancing something abstract, something universal, something taken for granted that we all would agree is intelligence, but that we're developing certain kinds of intelligence, such as surveillance intelligence or military intelligence. I mean, these are terms even in popular discourse. And so, it's curious that we live in a world that is often so schizophrenic. I mean, on the one hand, there's this enormous urge to do away with standardized intelligence testing as a precursor to getting admitted to institutions of higher learning, right? Because people recognize that these standardized tests have things built into them that could be called biases and that test you for one thing or another thing. But at the same time, we're saying, oh, let's go whole hog on AI. But which I is the A then enhancing? And why aren't we having the same kind of debate, saying that, no, the AI has already built into it directions and biases that privilege some kinds of ways of life, some kinds of assumptions about the moral world at the expense of others. So then the speed trap, I mean, it cuts a couple of ways. I'm sure that everybody in this room has been exposed at one time or another to a sentence like, the technology is advancing so fast. And usually it's coupled to the laws are not keeping up, the regulations are not keeping up, the ethical principles are not keeping up because of the speed with which the technology develops. So what is our recourse against that? There's interesting sociological work showing that in debating, public debating, which a lot of kids now do as precursors to getting into top colleges, that the speed of responses has climbed by several-fold over the last generation or so. So what has been privileged in policy debate is the ability to talk fast. Yet if you talk to scientists, for instance, who are learning how to communicate with people, they're often told, slow down. Say the ideas in a clear way, a simple way, a slow enough way that people can absorb. So why is it that the speeding up is given a benefit? And you might then ask, well, what are the contexts in which doing it faster gives you a relative value added? The stock market is one such place. So let's think about where that sort of calculating speed gets you somewhere, and where the hare is the animal that wins, as opposed to the place of judgment. The place of judgment is slow. Wisdom accumulates slowly, drop by drop, as some have said. Experience suggests you have to live through time in order to accumulate it. Tacit knowledge, the skill that a worker has in order to make something, that a surgeon has in order to do surgery. This is not the product of a day. Given a choice, if you know that somebody has done one kind of surgery, say brain surgery, one time and it's their first effort and they're at Chicago Medical School and are just learning, or somebody who has done this for 20 years, where would you go? I mean, so there are lots of places where we actually value slowness and the work of the tortoise over the work of the hare. It also bears back on democracy. I mean, so are technological ways of doing democracy necessarily better? I mean, there's now this whole idea that we can map and measure what a populace wants better by doing it by machine than we would be able to by going to them and listening to their often inarticulate ways of saying things because, people are confused, machines are not, or whatever. But maybe the confusion itself betokens something, and in one of the projects that we're doing at Harvard, which we call the Global Observatory for Genome Editing, one of the things we're trying to do is actually correct for the driving of debate into places where it's become very efficient, very quick. The questions are already framed. And what we want to do is ask people, well, is this the right way to frame this question? Would we come to very different conclusions if we framed it another way? And this is not in itself novel. I mean, so one of the things I want to suggest is when you come out of the technology realm, you tend to frame things in certain ways. But if you go sideways to a neighboring field, they will often tell you that's not the right thing to do. So if you talk to negotiation theorists, for instance, they will often tell you, avoid polarizing debate where two people or two parties have already come in having framed things in one way, that what you should be trying to do is look for alternatives or look for different ways to package the issues so that you can get into territory where the deliberation won't be my way or the highway, and then you're stuck, because if you don't want to go that person's way, then you have no other place to go. So in a time of profound American political polarization and rising polarization in many other places, it's worth keeping in mind that good deliberation often means not allowing things to harden into binaries in the way that the digital world so beautifully captures with its language of zeros and ones and the binariness of the representation. Then the last thing of these kinds of traps that I want to talk about is very closely related to my work on biology, and this is the dispersal trap. So where is the human? So law and moral philosophy and political theory came out of a sense that the human is organic. That is, the human represented in endless millennia of human representation. Some of the oldest artwork we have is representations of the female form, for instance. And people knew what it meant to be human because you could give it a form. But now we have set up side by side with that phenotypic human two different ways of taking the human apart. One is the genetic, with representations in DNA, and we're talking these days of the capability using information technologies of writing genomes, where we would actually be able to synthesize genomes that have not existed before, and with those synthetic genomes, of course, the kinds of creatures that are represented by those genomes that we write, so we take authorship. So that's one kind of dispersal, and the other one is in the digital world, right? I mean, so bits and bytes, we are stored in different places, and Dean Reimer told a story about how part of him is stored away in the information systems of another university where he was, shall we say, mined for his information at a certain time, and that information does not, in some sense, go away. So what do we do about the dispersed human? How does it relate to selfhood? And if we look at the biological world, we see that even in the physical world now, there are different ways that we have allowed pieces of ourselves to be represented. So the HeLa cell line has been quite famous because Henrietta Lacks did not actually authorize the extraction of that cell line, and books have been written and ethical debates conducted about that, and I won't stop on all of these, but spatial distribution, because pieces of us or information about us, biological information, may be stored in different places. I was recently talking to somebody who is working on genome editing who said that the first step in treating brain disease is to create an organoid of the brain, and he didn't seem to think there was anything weird about this. But now you're sort of taking a person's thought processes and creating a little homunculus of it, as it were. But what is the status of that in relation to the person from whom the material came? And what is the nature of the authorization that a person has? And these are things, I mean, in the discussion, we can talk about how law has dealt with some of these issues. But one reason why it matters is the temporality. And the temporality, to me, is deeply resonant and humanistic in a way. So I want to move to a completely different realm, the literary one. And if you go to Stratford, you see Shakespeare's tomb, and on Shakespeare's tomb it says, "Good friend, for Jesus' sake, forbear to dig the dust and close it here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones." So there's a sense that the bones are part of the human, and that the repose of the body after death depends on people not playing around with those bones. And of course, different religious traditions have very different ideas about that kind of relationship between your ontology in this moment and your ontology after death. But nevertheless, a sense that these are not unconnected exists in many spiritual traditions. In this country, you can turn quite secular and say that we do have technologies for enhancing the temporality of the self, and you can go to legal dispensations, and you can go to technological devices such as the databases and biobanks that I've already talked about, and the idea of transhumanism itself. But how does that bear back on the fact that we seem at the moment to be in a period of a certain kind of moral panic? What do we do about these different traps that people, to some sense, in some sense, do get the existence of, but they don't know how to spring themselves from the traps? And for the last piece of this talk, I want to say that there is no universal answer to this question, that we should beware a little bit about how we go forward, partly because there are no universal answers. And I want to go back to the moment when people started thinking about the storage of data and what kind of life it should have. And there's a case that many of you may know, but I'll come back to it in a second. But there were two discussions of that case back in 2014. This is already nearly 10 years ago. And two colleagues, one in Oxford and one at the Harvard Law School, looked at the same decision and said very different things. So Victor Meyer-Schonberger said that if you're always tied to the past, it's difficult to grow to change. Do we want to go into a world where we largely undo forgetting? So taking the memory of a person and putting it in a machine where it lasts forever, as opposed to putting it in Shakespeare's bones and leaving them there. What difference does it make to the world? Whereas Jonathan Zittrain at Harvard Law School said that, turned the discussion institutional and said, look, a court is not the right place to adjudicate this. So reading law out of the equation and saying that the evolving intricacies of the online world are the place, the frontier, where questions like this should be adjudicated. And true to form, America has tended to do that. Naturalize change, take it for granted, turn it into a market, and then privatize it and collectivize it as a good, a commercial good. This has been a sort of typical set of responses also in the era and the domain of AI. Whereas in Europe, there has been a different approach. And today it's summed up in the general data protection mandate. But before the law existed, there was already the idea that because of being dispersed, we are now a different kind of subject. Each of us is, among other things, also a data subject, and therefore the relationship between us as human subjects and us as data subjects does need to be thought through in a more systematic way. And as always, or as very often, resonant cases come out of very ordinary lives, and there was this Marion Costeja Gonzalez who had a story of debt that he felt was no longer part of his actual biography, that it was kind of accidental it had got into the internet, and he was being completely unable to get rid of it, and he brought a lawsuit against Google. It became known as Google Spain. And when the European Court of Justice heard that case, they decided that information should not be stored for all time, that there should be some connection between human memory and machine memory. So it was actually a metaphysical moment where they were saying, just because we have created these machines, it is not inevitable that we have now turned the identity of the human and the memory of the human into something that is in the control of the machine, that the machine needs to be controlled by us in some sense. Now, that goes some distance, but I don't think it answers all of the questions, which is why I think we're all here, because we want to think together about where to go next. And so what the human is in this era of technological convergence, where the biological, the material, the informational, all come together in ways that allow for processing the human, that, you know, Chicago used to have a meatpacking industry as well. So again, this is a good city in which to think about the ethics of processing. And how can we know the limits that should be placed? Where are those limits actually coming from? So let me conclude just with a few thoughts about what is to be done. I mean, so what do we do about this paradox of urgency where on the one hand we want speed, but on the other hand we want deliberation? And I'm reminded of a phrase in Brown versus Board of Education where the court came up with the idea of deliberate speed. I'm not sure they took it from a poem, but I'm not sure exactly what they meant. But they wanted to throw in some idea that speed itself can be a place of deliberation. People have been talking about slow science, not if we don't do it, China will do it, therefore full steam ahead, but that certain things need to be slowed down. And maybe everybody needs to be slowed down, but how? It's a different problem for saying how can we keep up and how can we compete with the next police department down the line? What about inclusivity and how do you bring in voices from the margins? Voices that may not be talking about the same issues as the voices on the frontiers. And that, again, is a profound reason to rethink democracy in a sense. I mean, it's a kind of violation of democracy to say that the whole demos must be thinking about the same issues as the makers of the most commercially relevant technology. Why? Maybe they have other things to care about. Maybe they care about, you know, their children's education and not about the next place to turn out the next fabulous AI product. And all of these things then have constitutional dimensions, and they are constitutional issues because they go to the definition and boundary of being human. I mean, where does human life begin and end? What is the boundary between the human and the machine or the non-human? And how do we make the separations? Who does? Who defines a term that I and others in my field call ontological surgery? Where does the one thing end and the other thing begin? And then loop back to, well, what are the implications? What are the implications for rights? What are the implications for dignity? And what are the implications for property? So I'll conclude with just a poem that I think makes us think about this question of the human, written, after all, about a century ago by one of the great British war poets who himself died right in the waning days of World War I. Move him into the sun, gently its touch awoke him once. At home, whispering of fields half sown, always it woke him, even in France, until this morning and this snow. If anything might rouse him now, the kind old sun will know. Think how it wakes the seeds, woke once the clays of a cold star. Our limbs so dear achieved, our sides full-nerved, still warm, too hard to stir. Was it for this the clay grew tall? Oh, what made fatuous sunbeams toil to break earth's sleep at all? Maybe that is the question for AI. Thank you.
Okay, I will in a minute be introducing our discussants for the next phase of our conversation. But let me first tell you a little bit about how it's going to go. They're going to come before you. They will have some time to speak, and then they will shepherd our discussion. And if you are a participant here, you may raise your hand if you would like to ask a question. But I implore you to wait for the microphone to come around to you, or the people who are watching remotely will not be able to hear what you say. If you are attending virtually, we are delighted to take your questions as well. You may ask them through the chat, and we will include you in the conversation. And Austin will, in fact, be managing that. So let me introduce our discussants. In addition to Torsten, who I was introducing before, we are joined by Aziz Huq, who is the Frank and Bernice J. Greenberg Professor of Law at the University of Chicago. He is a scholar of U.S. and comparative constitutional law. His scholarship concerns the interaction of constitutional design with individual rights and liberties. His research ranges from democratic backsliding to regulating AI. He co-authored How to Save a Constitutional Democracy with Professor Tom Ginsberg and published The Collapse of Constitutional Remedy with Oxford University Press. We'll also be joined by David Gunkel, who is the President of Research, Artistry, and Scholarship Professor of Media Studies at Northern Illinois University and Professor of Philosophy at Lazarski University in Warsaw, Poland. To say that he wrote the book on the rights of robots and other non-human artifacts is he writes correct, but also inaccurate. He has actually written and published 3 award-winning books on this subject, including The Machine Question, Critical Perspectives on AI, Robots and Ethics, Robot Rights, and Person, Thing, Robot, a moral and legal ontology for the 21st century and beyond. So with that, I will welcome you up.
Well, maybe I'll kick us off. I was sort of struck by one thing that you said, and I wrote it down at the time. People are confused, machines are not. Which I've sort of taken as a somewhat provocative statement. Because my sense is machines are also confused. They just don't know it. And they are, at least to the same level, confused, I think, as the people who created them and the people who trained them. So what I'm really interested in is the question is, AI doesn't just materialize. it needs to be designed, it needs to be coded, and it needs to be trained at least to a certain point. How can we conceive of AI that's either free of bias, or that those of us who use it can understand what the biases are and then act accordingly with the information that they receive?
Are we doing this in Q&A mode, or that you're commenting one at a time?
Well, I mean, this was sort of just a key thought that was on my mind, and I wondered if any of you had any thoughts on it.
Well, I didn't, I mean, that was not my assessment of AI versus people. It's one of the things commonly said, right? I mean, so the places where people want to substitute AI judgment for human judgment, it's one of the arguments that one often hears, particularly in areas like judicial sentencing, that the AI system takes the bias out. And then, of course, there's a big secondary literature by now saying, well, no, AI may be more logical, but it has its own biases built in. But why? Because there are humans back of the system still, and they're the ones building the biases in. But the ideal of the AI is that if you really got it right, at some point, it would take away the interstitial biases, in the law. One of the things people always talk about is, in what sort of mood did the judge wake up? And there have been studies done sociologically on whether sentencing before lunch and after lunch result in different, disparate lengths of incarceration and so on and so forth. So these kinds of human foibles, as we like to think about them, people think can be cut through by the logic of the AI system. I don't think anybody on this podium right now is a believer in that idea. But what machine confusion would look like has hitherto taken a weird kind of form. So one of the examples that's been much talked about in recent weeks and months is the questioning of Bing by one of the technology testers. And at some point, the machine became confused and started wanting to have a date with the questioner, and wanting the questioner to leave his wife, and telling him that he had a terrible Valentine's Day dinner and should go off with the machine instead. But this was deemed to be a sort of pressing the machine beyond the limits of its competence, and immediately a technical step was taken, that you should not talk to this machine for more than X amount of time. I mean, so it's like the rhetorics of what makes for human confusion or contradiction or illogic are not the same rhetorics that are applied on the machine side of things. And that is, I think, an interesting phenomenon to observe even before we start talking about, philosophically, what might we mean by machinic confusion. I'm totally prepared to discuss with all of you the sort of what the philosophical position would be about what is human confusion versus machinic confusion. I might argue that human confusion is often not confusion, that it is simply a matter of dealing with necessary ambivalence in ways that allow us to think through the multi-sidedness of very complex problems. And it's only a sort of post hoc judgment that we call it confusion, because we've privileged speech, because we've privileged binary answers. It is interesting to me that the country that invented the intelligence test, Mr. Binet's test, got picked up and used far more widely here, and the French themselves did not use it, and do not to this day use it. So this sense, which is culturally embedded, of what we deem to be, a privileged way of thinking of the human mind itself, is culturally created and constructed, and I think that these are things that need to be brought back to our discussion of the machine. So not just we had preformed biases and we thought the standard face was white and we therefore built into the machine an erroneous ability to, a misability to recognize black faces. Or that may be true, but I don't think that's getting to the depth of the problem.
I can make a set of comments. I apologize. I have to apologize to my fellow panelists because I was teaching until 12:45 and therefore missed the conversation in which you planned this. So I was not a participant in that. But I'm happy to make a slightly more lengthy comment. I think that's what you're anticipating. Is that
Absolutely.
Would that be okay? Well, thank you so much, first of all, Professor Jasanoff, for those marvelous and rich and extensive and provocative comments in the best possible sense of provocative, which linking together in the sense that they link together both themes, ideas, and elements of both the humanities, the law, and the arts that I think are in ways that are resonant and in ways that I think I and many others would not have thought to do. So I'm very grateful for the remarks themselves. I fear that my response is going to pick up on just one thread in the tapestry that you wove and try and tug on it to make a little bit more progress with respect to the rights and democracy question. And the thread that I want to pull on is the idea early on in your remarks that we must attend to what you call the political economy of intelligence in thinking about the ways that new computational tools are deployed so as to influence either rights or democracy. And that strikes me as being profoundly important and generative. I take it that it is not, and I am not in your field, but I take it that it is not controversial to say that the way that a particular innovation will be employed turns upon the perhaps happenstance distribution of resources, power, and hierarchy at the moment of invention. And I take one might look, and the particular historical moment will dramatically shift or change the way that inventions play out in the world. So the example that comes to my mind is the work of Fritz Haber at the beginning of the 20th century. Haber is responsible for the Haber-Bosch process, which is an essential part of industrial agriculture and has played a large role in feeding much of the world. But Haber also happened to be a chemist in Germany at the beginning of World War II and was responsible for the development of chlorine gas and mustard gas, using the same set of skills, the same set of knowledge that he used to help feed the world. I take it that combination of things, combination of innovations, would have looked quite different had he been had his innovation come into the world at a different point in time. Maybe we would have had one mustard gas without the other, Haber-Bosch, or vice versa. So context matters dramatically. And I take it that point is true with respect to democracy in particular. And I'm thinking here in particular of the work of David Stasovich, who's a political theorist and empiricist at NYU, who has written about the way in which the emergence and growth of popular involvement in government will depend upon the technological balance of power at a given moment in time between a broad mass of people and a political elite. And his basic point is where the elite has the technological instruments to limit and control a population without buying them off with democratic participation, you don't see that democracy happening. So I find that general framing a very useful and productive way of thinking about how and when AI will impinge upon rights and democracy at this moment in time. So in the United States, where I focus, one can think about, well, when is it that we see particularly agencies of government adopting AI, and when is it that we don't see them adopting AI? And the predictable patterns of, even if it was not predictable that AI itself would be invented or deployed in particular ways, given that it has been presented, the pattern of deployments, I think, is predictable, given your point about the importance of the political economy, of intelligence, political economy more generally. So where do we see AI being deployed? So if you look at the civilian regulatory sector, if you look at the agencies of either the national or the local or the state governments that are responsible for ensuring health, safety, collecting taxes, engaging in essentially the protection of the population through a helping hand, there are some adoptions, but they're very limited. They're relatively few and far between, and they're often handicapped by the fact that the agencies don't have the money to go out and buy an AI. They have to develop it in-house, and they have limited capacity to do that, particularly in a labor market where the people who would do that development can command higher wages in tech firms. So not much regulatory deployment. Turn, though, to the coercive sector, to not just to the military, but to police, and you see a profusion of adoptions and deployments. It's not the case that the police are developing instruments themselves. It's that there is a deep and aggressive secondary market of firms that market tools to police. And police generally are not subject to the kind of structures of rationality with respect to procurement or adoption of policies that other agencies are subject to. What that means is that police have funds, they have a will to use those funds to extend their coercive power, and they have very little by way of regulatory constraint that stops them from doing so, even when a technology is probably not cost justified. So a couple of examples of that from here in Chicago. 5 or 6 years ago, the Chicago Police Department deployed what it called an AI to identify people who it thought would commit acts of violence. It called this the strategic subjects list. It is probable that the underlying instrument, it's not entirely clear where it comes from because the police department was never candid about its origins, but it seems probable that it was an adoption of an instrument that was actually developed to identify people who are at risk of violence. And the police department was flipping it over and assuming that those at risk of violence were at risk of committing violence. Second example, as many of you in this room will know, Chicago, like many American cities, had a vigorous public protest around the Black Lives Matter movement. And there was a great deal of pressure to shift resources away from policing after 2020 toward community development and investment. One of the ways in which that pressure was derailed was a kind of moral panic around gun crime that found a technological, or that was responded to with a technological fix. One of the major investments of the Chicago Police Department since 2020 has been in a tool called ShotSpotter. ShotSpotter is an AI tool that uses the Internet of Things built around the city of Chicago that the University of Chicago helped to build in order to identify where gunshots have occurred. The claim is that doing so reduces crime. There is zero evidence that the millions of dollars spent by the city on ShotSpotter have any effect on crime. To the contrary, you can look at the patterns of gun crime over the last 2 years, and you can, I think, draw a reasonable inference that it has no effect at all. And yet it could be procured, installed, advanced and operationalized on the ground, quite apart from its racially disparate effects, quite apart from problems of whether the use of ShotSpotter evidence in an actual trial implicates issues of fairness because of its inaccuracy. The millions of dollars that could have been spent on mental health care, the millions of dollars that could have been spent on after-school programs have been spent on AI, an AI system that is integrated into the collection of information around our city. So those are examples of adoptions. An example of a non-adoption is, so for many years I've been involved in the ACLU of Illinois' efforts to regulate or to impose some sort of check on the police's practice of stop and frisk. New York, Chicago, at its height, the Chicago Police Department was stopping more people per capita than the New York Police Department at its height. One of the successes we had was getting the police department to record the stops. There are little slips of paper on which the actual stops are recorded. Still to this day, stops by the police department, and bear in mind that the fact of stopping somebody is the predicate to almost every form of police violence that I think many of us would find profoundly morally objectionable. So it's the thing that drives police violence. Those stops are still recorded on slips of paper. You have a technology that is how many thousands of years old, that is massively imperfect, that even in the absence of AI, one can imagine many ways of improving, and yet the city still uses slips of paper. So the pattern of deployment reflects the interests of the entities and the hierarchies that exist. And what I would draw attention to is the absences. The fact that AI, because it requires data, because it requires human capital, because it requires financial capital, tends to be deployed in institutional contexts where all of those three things are readily available and where there is what you could call a will to knowledge. And in those contexts in which the interests, the human interests at stake are dispersed, the human interests at stake are not able to coordinate in concentrated ways, right? As with the case of those who are at the receiving end of police violence in our city and elsewhere. You're not going to see AI used. You're not going to see AI deployed to identify those officers who are disproportionately responsible for unlawful stops or disproportionately responsible for unlawful violence. So I think that even that single point about the political economy of at the moment of adoption is incredibly generative and important. And I at least see it playing out in ways that impact profoundly what I think I don't think are disputably core rights to human dignity and integrity. I see that playing out in our city in issues and fields that are immediately salient to us. So I take that point and I would underscore it as something of tremendous importance and tremendous potential for thinking through different elements of the problem today.
Could I say a few things in response? Well, first of all, thank you for that deepening and widening of a phrase, political economy of intelligence, and showing the multiple ways in which it can play out in the practices of a city like Chicago and what the consequences are. I think that to get maybe yet another layer deeper, one would have to look at the ways in which different disciplines approach the same questions to some extent. And I'd say a couple of things back from a field that is theoretically constructivist, mine, science and technology studies. So of course, I agree with all of the things that you've said as descriptive matters. But I think that, and also your normative judgments about them. So I think, of course, you're right, that over-policing and seeing that stopping is the beginning of a long chain of events that leads to incarceration and differential incarceration and all of its problems. I mean, I think there's wide agreement among people of our class that these things are right. But when I said political economy of intelligence, I did mean to bring in things that were maybe not in your account fully. And one of them is that it goes to where in our different analytic systems we hold categories still and where we think categories are in the making or being made. So police in your account was somewhat stable. and you were comparing police departments in New York and Chicago, for instance, with regard to their statistics of stopping people and so forth. And my mind roved to this rather tragic story of a man who's been picked up in Belarus and sent back to Russia for God knows what amount of imprisonment because his 12-year-old daughter drew an anti-war picture and was turned in for that reason. I mean, this is not the only such story. The reason they gave for why the man was picked up was that he made the mistake of using his mobile phone, turned it on when he shouldn't have till he had escaped the clutches of the Russian sphere of influence totally. But it also said that somebody had likely turned him in. And that leads us to back in historical time, but also forward in historical time, to a reminder that it's not just the technological means, but also people's willingness to use those means. Are you going to be the Schindler's List person, or are you going to be the person who turns in your nearest neighbor because that neighbor makes the mistake of turning on their mobile phone in the wrong moment? And I think that the policing question cannot be divorced from the fact that in this country, a culture has been created in which in moments of crisis, this is now demonstrated over several decades, people go out and buy arms. And they feel that they are in the best position to be their own police. So it goes with the reduction of trust in institutions. It goes with the idea that you cannot be secure except when you have this machinic adjunct to your body, that it is not the kind of security that comes from having a neighborhood in which, I mean, you know, how are we different from Japan? I mean, why is it that not every Japanese goes off and buys a gun to keep themselves secure, but every Japanese knows exactly where their neighbors are and so on and so forth? I mean, so they're different forms of policing, right? I mean, so I think that it's not even that one, I mean, I think distributions of power have to be thought about in whichever system you have force operating in, right? A system in which every citizen is a police person vis-a-vis every other citizen needs critique every bit as much as a system in which we have a department and an administrative structure and the resources and so on and so forth. I think in this country, we've created an economy in which both the institutions and the individuals end up being armed to the teeth. And that is just not the case for all countries. So it does lead us into a field that I thought was mentioned as one of yours, which is comparative law as well, but law in the deepest sense. I mean, where does the idea of lawfulness itself come from, and how is that idea of lawfulness in a kind of dance of death, a dance of life with technological development? I mean, you know, I think these are the directions that we need to think in, and it's not obvious to me that Chicago policing will become, you know, socially acceptable policing by standards that are abroad in, you know, let's take 3 countries where I'm pretty sure the answer would be no, UK, Germany, and Japan. To get there, you would need some kind of wider transformation in which civil society would have to be involved, and not just police departments.
So I guess I get to go finally here. So I'd like to thank you for a wonderful talk and for providing us with food for thought and for conversation. So being the philosopher on the panel, I have to ask the philosophical question and fulfill the stereotype. So I will do so. Technology, especially emerging technology, always challenges existing ontological, axiological, epistemological categories about our world. And so it always provides an opportunity for reflection. As we're told, technology is as much an object as it is a mirror, and it's a mirror that reflects back to us what we think about ourselves and our society and our world. And I think your focus on the human and human rights makes a lot of sense, because there's a whole history in STS studies, especially feminist STS studies, in which we look at the redefinition and the challenges to human exceptionalism that has come to us in our technologies. People like Haraway have written about this, Hales, Rosie Brodati, et cetera. And I see that your work is very much in that sort of line and tradition, and that's very useful for us in terms of thinking about our situation as what makes us special, what makes us a unique entity among other entities in the world. But I think, and this is where I want to sort of zoom out a little bit and provide a wider framework for the conversation today, I think we can do the same thing that you have done in your keynote with human to the word rights in human rights. Because I think the technology also offers us an opportunity to question what we mean by rights. Who can have them? As Hannah Arendt puts it, who has the right to have rights? What they are and how they function as a social, political, legal, moral concept in our thinking about ourselves and our others that we encounter here. And with that in mind, I just want to put a couple of ideas on the table that we can work with. There's a very important binary that we inherit from the Romans, especially the work of Gaius, and that is that the world of things are divided into things and persons. And therefore, we are able to parse things out in terms of the persons who have rights and responsibilities and the things, which are just property possessed by persons. And this binary has been really codified in a lot of legal structures across the world, especially in the Western legal systems. And AI is really asking us, where does it fit? Is it a thing, or is it a person? Or is it something that doesn't fit the existing categories? Is it something that's outside the box of either person or thing? And I think this gives us a charge to think about our moral and legal structures that have been operative for over 2,000 years, but now are faced with a kind of being that doesn't seem to fit one category or the other very nicely or neatly. And you can see already there's a lot of debate about whether or not these things are just things or whether they should have some kind of electronic personhood, as the European Parliament had proposed back in 2017. Another thing I think this brings to mind for us is that we have to recognize that rights are not a univocal single concept. They're diverse and they're manifold. And oftentimes when we hear the word rights, our mind goes immediately to human rights. But all rights are not human rights. Human rights are a special subset, or at least a concatenation of special rights granted to what we call the human. There are other persons who have rights. We already live in a world where artificial entities have rights. We call these things corporations. And as a result, we're looking at a situation in which person and human don't map onto each other necessarily in our legal discourse and also in our moral discourse. And so we have to begin to think about a way of figuring out what we're talking about when we say rights. Are we talking natural rights that are God-given? Or are we talking about legal rights, which are agreements made by either legislatures or courts as to how to integrate things into our social reality? And I think an American jurist, Wesley Holfeld, had a really good way of sort of breaking this out for us. He said rights are really just powers, privileges, claims, and immunities by which we figure out competing interests in our social world. And when we look at that, we can already see now, here at this moment in time, we already have AIs and robots that have kind of rights. Ryan Abbott, who is head of the Artificial Inventor Project, has been filing patent applications all over the world to try to get an AI named Dabus recognized as an inventor on a patent application. It failed in the US and the UK, but not because Dabus didn't invent anything. It failed because of the way the law is written. They only recognize natural persons as inventors. It is successful in New Zealand and South Africa. So in New Zealand and South Africa, an AI is recognized as an inventor and has the right of intellectual property over its invention. Another small scale thing, but again, it shows us how our world is evolving. In 12 states in the US, personal delivery devices, I don't know if you got them around here, but we have them, my son is at University of Michigan, and they got them there. And they drive all over campus delivering stuff, like food and other objects. And in 12 states, the legislatures now have passed laws that give the robot the rights and responsibilities of a pedestrian when it's operating on the street. Now, this is not voting rights. This is not right to life. This is not like big stuff. It's small stuff. But you can see already how we are evolving a world in which these categories are getting to be increasingly blurry and increasingly problematic for us to just compartmentalize things the way we have in the past. So the same way in which the human is being challenged by these technologies, I think the rights are being challenged by these technologies. So then when we say the human rights in the 21st century, we have to at least broaden our perspective to recognize that both of these things are open to some sort of dispersion, some sort of redefinition that is on our shoulders to figure out, because this is not about the robots and the AI, it's about us. It's about what we value, and it's about what world we want to create as we move forward. And so I think your talk really plugs into a lot of that worry and concern that a lot of us are experiencing currently. And so that's my contribution.
I mean, again, it's really a place of rich conversations. I guess I'll say one or two disciplinary things. So I think that many fields begin, I mean, this is something I said before, what does a discipline hold still and what does it not hold still? Many disciplines begin with categories that are already given and then ask about its meanings. And you began with, you know, a philosopher's riff, just the way historians begin with historians' riffs and so on. So the STS riff is, it's not the starting point, it's the end point. So not there are natural rights and there are legal rights, but there are things that we end up calling rights because we have chosen to give them a kind of debate status, if you will. When you assert it, you get certain things. I mean, they are, in that sense, technologies themselves. Mm-hmm. And what they are, I mean, natural rights are not, of course, you didn't mean it anyway. It's not that they're God-given. It's that we have chosen to act as if they're God-given and decided that those are different from the ones that are human-given. But these are things that are right now in profound contestation around questions of gender, as, of course, all of us in this room recognize. I mean, what is the naturally given right that we have to express our gender identities, and why is one thing natural and not the other, and how do we resolve it? Do we resolve it by saying biology says this, or do we resolve it by saying the Constitution says this, or do we resolve it by saying that the legislature just enacted the Marriage Equality Act and that says this? I mean, you know, these are different ways of getting to the question of tomorrow, what shall we take to be natural? So in the little word naturalize that I slipped somewhere into the middle of my talk is a whole trajectory of STS theorizing about the ways in which we get to the end point of knowing that something is natural or not. And I will absolutely agree with you that we are in a moment of flux on many fronts. I mean, so the whole question of in the environment out there, is a river a thing, or is it an entity that has its own autonomous rights that can be asserted? And if so, how do we assert it? Not since 1972 and Christopher Stone's Should Trees Have Standing has there been as much debate around what a natural object is entitled to. But in the area of reproductive technologies, even in the area of things like cancer research, we've had all kinds of boundary crossing entities for a long time, and what their status is morally and ontologically has been very much in question. I guess again, I doubt that we're in deep disagreement on this, but I think we might formulate it differently. It's not that rights should not be queried in the same way. It's just that in my field, you would need to query both elements in the same way, at the same time, because how you naturalize things will bear on what normative meanings attach to those things, and vice versa. So I think that a strong axiomatic statement might be in STS that every time you're deciding a normative question, or one that looks normative to a philosopher or even to ordinary people, you are at the same time creating a dispensation of how the world is that supports that normative statement. And equally, every time you're coming up with a description of or intervention into the world, you are necessarily destabilizing or reconstituting or throwing up new questions about what the normative order of that ought to be. I mean, the Fritz Haber example from before is an excellent example of this. As long as it's just a chemist doing his thing and creating something in the lab, it's one thing. But once it gets weaponized as an instrument of war, and then finds its way eventually into actually one of the first international treaties that thou shalt not do chemical warfare, which continues to reverberate right into our century. And was the attack on Iraq justified or not? I mean, you could tell that entire 100-year trajectory from Fritz Haber to W as a co-productionist story of what is a chemist's invention, really. Is it normative? Is it natural? Is it in the natural order? Is it humans remaking the meaning of war? Is it disrupting the very idea of what being in a just or unjust war is all about? I mean, you know, you could tell the creation of the chemical as a story that is at one and the same time a story about the creation of normativity around this thing that we call war. That would be an STS disciplinary approach to addressing some of these same questions. And then we in STS would very much talk to lawyers to see what their understanding of these very same categories is, and talk to philosophers to see what their understanding of these very same categories is, because the syntax of meaning in disciplines looks different. And if we were to have machine translation among our three different fields of thought, we would need to understand that grammar, which is why I picked up Noam Chomsky saying that AI just isn't ever going to do the same kind of thing as the human brain, because there was a linguist, my PhD is in linguistics. So, I mean, you know, I think that if we are to have interdisciplinary conversations that move us forward, it's to some extent understanding the deep structures of where the sort of exacting questions, the mobilizing questions, I find that a really annoying statement by a philosopher, that kind of, you know, sort of burr in the saddle comes from, and then we have the interesting discussions.
Thank you.
I've kept my sort of response deliberately very short because I'd already spoken, and I know we'll have questions from the audience. I just wanted to throw one quick comment in, maybe widening the discussion a little bit further. So we've heard a lot, I think, in your responses about the state, partly the state as an actor, or the state as sort of setting the regulatory framework. But one thing that I'd really like to discuss with the audience, and it's probably partly where I'm coming from, is looking about the creators and the commercial interest in sort of training and developing AI and the challenges that brings. And also, in some ways, I think we have, although an imperfect framework, on controlling, at least in a democracy, the state as an actor, because we can vote. Now, we can have a long discussion on how effective that is and if a different government would use AI in policing differently. But currently, a lot of the AI development is driven in a commercial environment over which we have very, very little control. And yet we already see in the large social media companies how it has an impact on debate. And that debate then again has an impact on how opinions are formed and how voting is being formed. So one of the key questions on my mind is, do we need some regulatory intervention in, say, the use of AI in shaping public opinion? And if we do, that then goes to the point of, is AI an actor in its own right, an entity, or is it something that's controlled by humans, or what status does it have? But if we do, will we then not find that we get into interesting questions on freedom of speech if we start regulating the sort of online public discourse by trying to keep negative effects of AI out? And how could a kind of regulation of AI look like that allows democratic discourse to sort of question both state actors but also public actors? And that's a question that's very much on my mind. But I think we've probably already said quite a lot, and you should have an opportunity to ask us questions now.
Hello, hi, I'm Jim Sparrow, History Department here. This is an incredibly generative conversation, very provocative, and I can't get over how urgent the questions that have been raised. So to build on Torsten's question, it seems to me that I would love to hear you address the question of, should we collaborate? And part of what makes AI so powerful is our participation in AI. Every time we conduct a search, or now every time people ask a question of ChatGPT, they're actually helping ChatGPT learn. And I'm struck as an historian by how much of the knowledge of the past, how much history, how many of the books on the stacks here in the library don't shape the structure of what comes out through AI, or just through simple searches, which also use AI. And it seems to me that this is because there's the inevitability that you were talking about doesn't come from necessarily technological determinism, although that's the way it's perceived and talked about, but it comes from the political economy, that those who build and run and train the AIs have a particular set of use cases that serve business models and a corporate framework that is not actually taking input. It's feeding off of the knowledge that is the corpus on which AI trains, but it's not, in fact, including judgments, decisions, much less creativity and notions of ethical relationships to knowledge. So my question is a practical one. I mean, as an historian, I've wondered, should historians make an initiative to train AI so that historical sensibilities can counteract the tendency to erase the past and to obliterate ways of knowing that have emerged over decades through precise knowledge about the past? And I'm sure other disciplines might feel the same way. Or is that simply feeding into a process by which the knowledge production will simply be primitive accumulation in the Marxist sense of capitalism? Will it simply be generating surplus value that will make AIs more powerful, more knowledgeable, but less responsive, and also maybe less humanistic? So how to preserve the human in the inputs of the system is one question. And the other is, the outputs will not just become epistemic products that shape what we can know. In Laurence Lessig's sense, they'll become code, right? The AI in learning will shape our world in ways that are effectively legislation, even though they're encoded as algorithms and as software. And so how can we ensure democratic accountability as a result of our participation, rather than having our participation build less accountability over time as the AI becomes smarter and more knowledgeable? And by smarter, I don't necessarily mean intelligent in the human sense, but more hegemonic, more capable of actually pushing out the discretion and creativity that human intelligence actually would exercise if it were in charge.
I can maybe try a very quick answer from a sort of mixed historian library perspective. I'm a bit fatalistic. These tools exist, they will be used, and the large tech companies will train them on whatever they get hold of. So from a librarian's perspective, withholding the information that we have here from AI will, unless someone else stops all of this happen, not stop the AI from existing. It will not stop it from being used. It will just mean that it's more limited in the data that it can draw. And I think we've sort of seen this in what we heard earlier. Some of the cases where some of the AI chatbots have fallen over is when they were asked about things that happened very recently, because they are not trained on information from the last few months. I think in the case of ChatGPT, it was 2021, I think, where the line's drawn. And there is now some research going on in libraries and amongst sort of academics who research information about how much, say, of the open access body of scholarly information that's out there has been used, and just trying to get a better understanding of what corpus they have been trained on. But arguably, as libraries, we are here to give humans access to, as much as we can, the world's knowledge. And if humans use AI tools, then I would argue it should be our job to make sure they have access to the most diverse knowledge possible, also speaking for most diverse voices. It's not something that we've always been good at in libraries, to bring all diverse voices to the table, but arguably the challenge becomes even more important to do it and to make sure it's not just certain voices or certain data that feeds into the development. That's at least, I think, a partial attempt at an answer.
I'll just quickly say that the resistance fighters right now are the artists. Because the generative systems, like diffusion, are trained on all the artwork that is scraped from the internet. And artists are finding that their intellectual property is being repurposed and remixed by the generative AI. And there's no way to opt out. It is already in the data set. So there's no way to back out of all the data that's already there. And this is where the artists now are trying to figure out a way to build consent into the training data, where there is none, and there is no regulatory schema for consent. They just get, as you say, anything they can get their hands on. And if you've posted any art to the internet, you've given the AI your art. And so this is raising a big problem in the arts community.
Of course, those could be taken as examples of inevitability. I mean, it doesn't have to be that way. We certainly have law deciding that the Obama election poster really was a licensable version of a photograph that came before. I've been to exhibitions, I'm sure you have too, of museums showing the things that they bought as authentic, whatever. There was a very famous one about the Metropolitan in New York and the works that it had bought, believing them to be authentic Rembrandts at a certain time. Would the AI have known? Well, it kind of depends whether the AI was trained in the latest kind of chemistry or material science or whatever. But going back to I think the deep question you raise, where does the self-confidence of a historian come from? In STS, we have a term called interpretive flexibility, and it is that the data point does not speak for itself, that it is always embedded in such an ocean of interpretive possibility that there will be flexibility that will come from the standpoint represented by the interpreter. Now, there are incredibly well-studied historical phenomena, like what caused World War I. Reams and reams of books have been written. Do you really believe, I'm sure you don't, that all the training in the world would produce an answer to that? Or would it always be the sense that the wisdom of an age, the sort of concerns of an age will drive people in that age to interpret their own experience in a variety of different ways? The great movements within history of the last 100 years or so have been about historiography rediscovered because of the sensibility that certain voices either had been excluded from the recording or had been excluded from the interpreting, or both. And that has led to major changes in the way in which history itself is practiced as a discipline. But does subaltern studies tell you the real story, or does it only tell you a version that we might well put side by side with our great man theories? And, there may be some context in which a famous female historian might still say, for this particular thing, I'm more inclined to believe the great man theory than the subaltern theory because of such and such and such. Would the AI come and tell you, oh, the real thing is this? I mean, I don't think that would ever happen. But another thing you said could happen, that the myth-making, that it is all-knowing because we have trained it, fed it our all, gives it this hegemonic potential. So we end up believing that, yes, that is the true story. Now, it could blunt critique, it could blunt our sensibilities about what has not been fed into it, but I don't see that a self-confident field of history should worry about collaborating with the AI. I mean, what does it mean that you would have the AI look at an even larger corpus of stuff than you might be looking at? I mean, so I have a daughter who's a pretty well-known historian, and I have a husband who's a pretty well-known Indo-Europeanist. They both deal in history of different sorts. So in the field of Indo-European studies, it can be that the discovery of a barely known form in a relatively esoteric dead language does change one sense of how grammar evolved around that formation, that morphology or whatever. So, digging up data can actually reveal an anomaly or show an answer and things like that. And the AI might be helpful for doing that. But would it really address sort of fairly deep-going questions about, what the relationship was between certain kinds of artifactual developments and what happened to the civilization dying out or whatever? I mean, I just don't see it. I mean, frankly, I don't see why, unless you do away with the idea of interpretive flexibility totally, that you do believe that an infinite number of data points speak for themselves, that you really attribute godlike capability to this all-knowing machine when all it knows is what we have told it to know anyway. I mean, I just don't see why history's task would be eliminated. It may have adjuncts added to it, that people are asked to look at certain kinds of things, but not, I mean, you began by saying, should we collaborate? Of course, we are collaborating already, but I'm not sure, I mean, the question might be more in what ways, to what extent? I mean, are you going to require of all your PhD students that they do an AI search to make sure that they've got everything related to their topic? Then you'd have to define, what does it mean to be related to your topic?
Yeah, I'm sorry, and I know we have limited time, so I'm not going to drag on my part of this, but I wasn't suggesting a fear that AI would produce something superior. I was more worried about it crowding out expert knowledge or just a diversity of voices around wisdom of crowds, vernacular approach. I mean, conspiracy theory or, sort of theories and approaches that are dominant just because of the disposition of who has the loudest voice in contemporary discussions of history at the current moment, and that would bake in or lock in a set of dominant frameworks so that this proliferation of 1,000 or 1,000,000 points of view and more data, which could be incredibly rich, might actually, on the contrary, reinforce dominant frameworks. But I realize we have other questions in the room, so I won't press the point.
Hello, thank you for coming and thank you for your insights. I'm Ahan, I'm a philosophy and law literature student here. So it seems to me that given all these questions regarding the consent of artists to AI using their art or the lines of the human or the digital person, while as experts, members of academia, you can debate them, since we are trying to kind of maintain democracy despite AI, it has to come down to a democratic process. So then my question becomes, that requires a certain way of educating the public on what this artificial intelligence actually is, right? It seems to me that there'd be such an amount of knowledge which would be required to understand what exactly is a neural network, for example. What does it mean to say it's learned something? What is the I in the AI? And then, so for any of those sort of normative judgments so that people can have informed positions to influence their representatives and then actually have laws passed to settle these issues. There seems to be like a huge education gap regarding, and then you might even need sort of philosophical training about like, what is a mind, what is a self? So how do we approach the practical issue of educating the public, that too without injecting then particular normativities as like, this is what AI is, and thus sort of begging the question in any kind of democratic debate which would occur around AI rights.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just say very quickly that one of the things that you're raising is a fundamental question of what should people know in a democracy to be able to live with the products of their own ingenuity and the societies that result from that. And I think that does change from decade to decade, century to century, and is one of the most fraught and debated things in universities, because what you teach people is a form of exercising power, and people disagree deeply about what the lexicon of must-know stuff is. Do I think that these days it's important for undergraduates in American universities to have some, kind of basic sense of what these machines are capable of and, what some ideas of AI might be. Yeah, I do. But I wouldn't necessarily go from that to saying everybody must have, experience building a neural network, say. I mean, these are debatable things that you would have to ask questions about, and we live in very complicated societies where, in fact, we don't say everybody has to know everything. We say much more that people need to know where to go to look things up. They need to have the capacity to know where the expertise lies. They need to know what even is a domain of expertise in the first place. Some places, like medicine, we've built huge infrastructures to enable that. Other places, it's in the making, and in our relationship with computers, it's in the making. But I don't know how it is in Chicago, but today computer science is possibly the most popular undergraduate major at a place like Harvard. And I would say that what they're missing is sensibility on the philosophical, moral, ethical, historical, humanistic front. So I think your wish that people should know what a neural network is closer to being realized than, the what should we do about it or with it.
I think on that note, we're going to have to end our question period. If we could thank our panelists for this rich discussion.